Well, tension between China and the West is becoming acute for several reasons. First of all, there's Hong Kong. It did have preferential trade terms with the US compared to mainland China. Not anymore. Here's President Trump making the announcement.
Hong Kong will now be treated the same as mainland China. No special privileges, no special economic treatment, and no export of sensitive technologies.
And that was followed up by this from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
If China treats Hong Kong as one country and a single system, so must we. General Secretary Xi Jinping made a choice to violate the Chinese Communist Party's promises to Hong Kong that were made in a UN-registered treaty. He didn't have to do that. He made that choice. We have to deal with China as it is, not as we wish it to be.
Well, China says its response to all this will include sanctions on people and entities in the US, and it's summoned its US ambassador. This is, of course, all part of broader US-China tensions. We've had American pressure on the Chinese tech firm Huawei, and now for the first time, the US has said the Chinese pursuit of natural resources in the South China Sea is completely unlawful. Now, China's been building military bases on these artificial islands in this area for years, but the US has never called them illegal before. China, in return, in this tweet, says the US deliberately distorts facts and international law. And then we have Mike Pompeo saying this.
On Monday, for the first time, we made our policy on the South China Sea crystal clear. It's not China's maritime empire. If Beijing violates the international law and free nations do nothing, then history shows that the CCP will simply take more territory. That happened in the last administration. Our statement gives significant support to ASEAN leaders who have declared that the South China Sea disputes must be resolved through international law, not might makes right. What the CCP does to the Chinese people is bad enough, but the free world shouldn't tolerate Beijing's abuses as well.
Well, on all of this, here's Gary O'Donoghue in Washington.
This relationship is spiraling downwards and spiraling out of control in some ways. The kind of yelling that's going on from Washington and Beijing at one another now has reached a particular pitch in the last few weeks, I think, with these two great powers really in a standoff with potentially really serious spark points, not least in the South China Sea, where the US, of course, is conducting what it calls freedom of navigation exercises. It did one just yesterday with a destroyer sailing through some of those disputed waters to prove to China that it wouldn't accept its territorial claims in the area.
Well, next let's talk about Huawei. It's a Chinese tech giant. Yesterday we told you about the UK excluding it from all parts of the UK's 5G mobile networks because of security concerns. Well, China now says the ban is groundless. Have a listen to the Chinese ambassador to the UK.
I think the trust is a serious damage between the country level, between the government level, and among the businesses.
And then note the tone of this from the Chinese Foreign Ministry.
In
the end, this is a big world, and the United Kingdom is only a small part of it. Ultimately, this ban will not stop Huawei from prospering.
While the BBC's Stephen McDonald was at that press conference in Beijing, here's his analysis.
The real point to come out of this press conference today was that the Chinese government is saying it doesn't really know whether it's safe to invest in the UK anymore. Specifically, they're saying that Chinese companies should be weighing up what they're describing as the political risk of operating inside Britain. So definitely a lot of pressure between London and Beijing over this decision. And, you know, Beijing's saying it's going to safeguard the interests of its companies somehow or other. We just don't know exactly what that will mean, though, in terms of, actual reprisals.
So, pressure on the UK from Beijing, but bear in mind before the decision on Huawei, there had been severe pressure on the UK from Washington, not least because of US sanctions, which will make it harder for Huawei to manufacture its own microchips. That was a fact that exacerbated the UK's security concerns leading into yesterday's decision. And then on Huawei, there's more from the Americans. Here's Mike Pompeo.
The United States has a Huawei announcement of our own today. The State Department will impose visa restrictions on certain employees of Chinese technology companies like Huawei that provide material support to regimes engaging in human rights violations and abuses globally.
So Hong Kong, South China Sea, Huawei, these are all stories demonstrating the sharp deterioration in China's relations with the West. All very different to back in 2017 when President Trump welcomed President Xi and his wife to Mr. Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. Go back to 2015, here you have President Xi enjoying a pint in an English pub with David Cameron, but evidently things have shifted. Here's Stephen McDonnell again.
China is fighting so many Western countries at the moment on so many fronts. You do have to wonder when something has to give. I mean, sure, this is a big, powerful economic juggernaut of a country, and it knows that people have to, sit up and listen when Beijing speaks to them. However, you just look at the fights China's having with the US, Canada, Australia, Britain, France, the list goes on. And the thing is that the global economy is so integrated these days that the West needs China and China needs the West. I think everybody knows this ultimately. It's just that somehow or other there's going to have to be a path forward. At the moment, though, it's so hard to see what it is, given that there are, just like I say, fighting over the South China Sea, trade, the coronavirus, threats going back and forth, more sanctions. It's just hard. It really is hard to see at the moment what it will take for China to get back on a sort of normal footing, if I could put it to you that way, with the West.
Well, let's step back and look at this further from China's perspective. Rebecca Harding is the author of The Weaponization of Trade.
China plays a game of strategy, so it's not necessarily worrying about winning, it's worried about gaining influence and so on. So in this situation, what we have to worry about is that the two sides are misunderstanding each other, and therefore you've got the huge potential for miscalculation. In the end, what this is about is the influence over an economic space. It's about economic conflict, if you like, rather than direct military conflict. And that's always risky because for as long as you've got countries behaving in a more nationalistic way, for as long as you've got countries behaving in this kind of more antagonistic way, trade is a dangerous weapon.
Well, we always like to look at these major global stories from a number of perspectives. Next, let's get the analysis of Zhao Yunfeng from BBC Chinese in Washington, D.C.
It's certainly getting very difficult for China. We're seeing the situation, which is China versus the rest of the world in many forms. China is being attacked here. The government has pledged to take countermeasures to retaliate sanctions and limitations related to Huawei, Hong Kong, largely coming from the US. So one of the options Beijing might have right now is to impose sanctions or put US companies on a blacklist. But the problem with that is US tech companies like Apple and Microsoft, they are already deeply embedded in Chinese people's daily life. So this move is going to hurt China's interests as well. And all these retaliations also comes with the risk that China will be seen as a bully. But from Beijing's point of view, China is the one being bullied here.
And talk to me about the South China Sea, because this is an issue which comes up every so often, but the American language has increased. Presumably China's not going to change tack, though, in terms of what it's doing.
Indeed, today we heard from Secretary Pompeo that the US will use all available tools to support Southeast Asian allies with regard to South China Sea and China's territorial claims there. And in China, this will be seen as yet another attempt from the US to bring China down. And among all the China-bashing rhetoric and policies coming from Washington these days, this one would have the potential to provoke the strongest response, because two countries can argue all about trade disputes or Hong Kong or Xinjiang, but South China Sea is about territory. And the two countries' navy have had some pretty tense interactions here. So countries could really go to war over all these seemingly insignificant rocks.